to say the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act is, quote, the law of the land. And, it's kind of ironic because some of my colleagues, about 53 of us, have signed on to the House resolution stating that we believe that Obamacare has yet to be the law of the land because it violated the origination clause of the U.S. Constitution when it was passed. And we don't talk about that a great deal. The bottom line that is at issue here is that if the U.S. Senate can take a totally unrelated piece of legislation and strike everything with the number and take legislation that they call the Senate Health Care Bill and place it in its entirety, which raises taxes to an enormous degree, if they can take any bill in the House and do that, then I would suggest to you, especially after the Supreme Court has labeled Obamacare a tax, they've officially called it a tax. And if indeed it can be done this way, then I would suggest to you that the origination clause is a dead letter. There is no more purpose for it being in the Constitution.
As a gentleman from North Carolina, the former U.S. Attorney, Mr. Holding.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Professor Turley, throughout your testimony, you've alluded several times that there are instances that you believe that the president has stepped over the line. And we've talked about a number of them, but I just ask for you to recap and maybe give us our top 5 instances where you think that he has overstepped the line and breached the Constitution.
Well, thank you very much, Congressman. First of all, I do think that there's a number of provisions in the ACA where he did overstep the line. The decision on individual mandates strike me as a rather obvious policy determination from the president that he did not want to see it enforced, given the amount of public opposition that occurred and accusations of a bait and switch. Those are all political issues. This was not some Clean Air Act regulation that was stuck in the mire of regulatory disagreements as to a command and control statute. I also believe that the mandate, the employer mandate, which was also extended, constitutes a significant change in legislation. I also believe that the immigration issue is well across the line. I actually agree with the president on the decision that was made, but that doesn't matter because it was not made in a way that is allowed under our Constitution.
With Professor Turley.
I'm sorry, the last part of the question.
What right does the House of Representatives have to pick and choose what part of government gets funded?
Well, I think the answer is clear that in this sort of orbital hole that these 3 branches are placed by the framers. The key power given to Congress and the House of Representatives was the power of the purse to control the funds. What is alarming about this situation is that even that power is being challenged and being marginalized.
Okay. Professor Rosencrantz.
Well, Article 1, Section 8 gives you the power to decide what provisions, what you want to fund and what you don't want to fund.
And Professor Cannon, Lazarus.
Professor Rosencrantz took the words right out of my mouth.
Article 1, Section 8. Is that okay?
Article 1, Section 8, along with the Senate.
Okay. And, Mr. Chairman, I would ask that we provide a copy of the answer to this question to Senate Leader Reid, since he asked that question. Now, with regard to Libya, the President said he didn't need to come to Congress in order to get our authority to start bombing in Libya. And that was a concern to some of us. He said, he'd been asked by the Organization of Islamic Conference, all 50 or 57 states, whatever they got, 50, 57, and also by some of the NATO allies that use Libyan oil. So he didn't need Congress approval because he had those requests. He was initially prepared to help the Syrian rebels, in which Al-Qaeda had become, not initially, but they had become the most profound part. And he was ready to start bombing the Syrian leader that Hillary Clinton had called a reformer. Initially, he planned to do that without Congress's consent. He didn't think he needed Congress's consent, but obviously once there was a lot of political pushback he threw it to Congress and let them decide. But I'm curious from each of you, what gives the president the authority to order bombing, even if he promises to limit the numbers of people that he will kill? What gives him authority to go start bombing a country? Obviously, we'd consider it an act of war if any country started dropping bombs over us. Well, what gives him that authority? I'm curious from each of you.
Well, first of all, I think it's a great question, because I was a little confused when Mr. Lazarus says no one's accused President Obama of being inclined to engage in war without a declaration. I was in court with members of this committee saying exactly that in the Libyan war conflict. And what disturbed us is that the White House came back and said the reason we don't need a declaration of war is because the president alone defines what a war is, and he's simply saying this isn't a war. And when we talk about the dangers, this is a danger of a different kind. And it not only is a danger of separation of powers, obviously, and a direct violation of the express language of the Constitution, but this administration, through these acts and through the large number of drone attacks, is returning the world to a state of nature. We are taking down critical international legal principles that have governed this world, that have respected territorial limitations. I just spoke to the NATO parliamentarians, and I told them, you will loathe the day that you endorse the U.S. position that they can take unilateral action when somebody vaporizes someone in the middle of London.
Well, my time is about to run out, so let me morph that into this question to each of you, get your answer. You know, the president ordered Anwar al-Awlaki killed by a drone strike in Yemen, an American citizen, without any due process, as we've come to know it. I asked the question in this room at another hearing, you know, how far does that order extend? I mean, if al-Awlaki came back to Capitol Hill and led prayers as he had before of congressional staffers, was that order still good? I wanted to know in case the drone strike was still on. What authority do you think the president has to order American citizens killed in other countries in which we're not at war or in the U.S.? So if y'all, my time's up, but if I could get answers to that question from each of you.
As quickly as you can, given the subject matter.
I don't believe he has authority to do that. They've cited things like hot pursuit, which makes no sense. It's not an imminent threat. I believe the president's kill list policy is flagrantly and dangerously unconstitutional.
I think it's quite a difficult question, but the Obama administration's Office of Legal Counsel memo on this is certainly quite strained. So they are reaching for analogies and analysis that is quite unconvincing, I'd say.
I am very, very far from an expert on these matters, but I would just offer one observation, and that is, I don't really see why the American citizenship issue in the case that the congressman is referring to is all that significant. I think that if a Nazi general happened to have been an American citizen, it wouldn't alter the way we could deal with it militarily. But there are weighty questions about the president's authority to implement the drone program. I don't really have an expert view on that.
Briefly,
I think it's been very effective militarily, so that is a good thing.
I'll just associate myself with Professor Turley's comments.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate y'all's testimony.
thank the gentleman from Texas. The chair will now recognize another gentleman from Texas, Mr. Farenthold.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the opportunity to ask some questions here. And I'm going to ask for y'all's help in answering what's probably the number one question I get at town hall meetings and people running up to me at the grocery store when I'm back home in Texas. And it goes something like this. And in light of, and you can insert whatever you want, Benghazi, Fast and Furious, the IRS targeting of advocacy groups, NSA overreach. If you like your health care, you can keep it. Varying the terms and waivers of Obamacare. The number one question I get is, what can you do about it?
Getting Democrats to care about this issue when there's a Democratic president. and getting Republicans to care about these issues when there's a Republican president.
And that's one of the things.
Right now, I don't know if anyone who's watching this at home has noticed, but all the Democratic members of the committee have left the room. I think they left like 20 minutes. We're 3.5 hours into this hearing. They're obviously not as interested in this as
And finally, I think one of our problems here is we have a president right now who is not willing to work with Congress. I think that's what we just had a Democrat walk in. That's not willing to work with Congress.
I retract my statement. My apologies.
I've talked to a constituent who worked for the Bush White House, whose job it was to lobby with Congress. And I've met with somebody from the Obama administration exactly twice in 3 years. And I do think it's the president's duty to engage. I had a question on that, but I'm out of time. But I do think there is a disappointment with the president not being engaged. Mr. Cannon.
But if I may, Republicans are very concerned about executive power when the executive is a Democrat. Democrats are very concerned about executive power abuses when the executive is a Republican. I think that the members of each party need to care about these issues a lot more when their own if someone from their own party occupies the White House, and not just when someone from the opposite party.
Thank you. I see my time has expired. Chairman Gowdy, I'll give it back to you.
Thank the gentleman from Texas. Chair will now recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, sir. I have obviously missed some of this hearing, although I've caught some of it on the magic of video, television. And I was interested, the gentleman from Mr. Cannon had mentioned the possibility of impeachment or some impeachable offenses. Is that accurate?
I can't remember if I brought that up. I may have.
And in what context would you have brought that up?
I think in response to a question. I'm not sure if I did or if someone else had mentioned.
Can anybody on the panel refresh his memory?
I think what I brought up was a constitutional amendment convention. I'm not sure. I don't think I brought up impeachment, but it's certainly that I agree that it's certainly a tool that the Congress can use to restrain the executive.
Constitutional amendment. You suggested we should have some type of convention?
The question I was asked about ways of the Congress or the people can restrain the executive, and I offer that as one way.
That's never been done before, has it?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Yeah. Anybody else on the panel have any thoughts about impeachment?
I mentioned impeachment earlier. We've been asked several times questions about possible remedies if we find that a president is behaving lawlessly. I've not said that this president has or that these examples rise to that level, but the ultimate constitutional check on a lawless president is impeachment and ultimately election.
Right, that's the check. But nobody suggested that the president certainly not committed any impeachable offenses, I presume. Nobody here thinks that. Is that right? Mootness? You, Mr. Cannon?
Well, I don't know. As Professor Rosenkranz mentioned, I think an important element is that that whatever crimes or misdemeanors he's committed were committed knowingly, and whether there is a pattern of abuse of his office. And in my testimony, you'll see that I actually lay out a pretty consistent pattern whereby the President Obama has ignored and tried to rewrite portions of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. And I think that the most egregious of these is the one where he is implementing the law in a way such that he is taxing and borrowing and spending over the next 10 years. $700 billion that this Congress never authorized. Now, you may disagree with my interpretation of the law. I know Mr. Lazarus does, but I think that you and I and Mr. Lazarus would all agree that if a president were trying to tax and borrow and spend $700 billion without congressional authorization, that might be an impeachable offense.
Does anybody here think any of the actions of the Bush administration and going into Iraq without actual knowledge of weapons of mass destruction or anything else would have been a impeachable offense? Mr. Lazarus, you seem to be nodding.
No, I was just disregard the nod behind the curtain or in front of the curtain.
Obamacare. I don't see that in there where the president, we gave him the authority to postpone a tax, but he does it. Now, if he has the legal authority to do that, which I doubt, but he used that authority, what is to prevent him from just going looking at the IRS code, which is a mess? I don't know any American that thinks the IRS code is a good bill. But rather than fix it, we just make it bigger every year. So the president goes to the IRS code and says, well, this group of businesses, they're just having a bad year, like green businesses. Or we could use the energy companies on the other end, those oil and gas industry. I'm just going to postpone them paying income tax for a year. Why? Because I said so. Or I'll take this group and do something similar. Tweak their tax. Rather than paying 38%, they're going to just pay 20% for the next year. It seems to me if he has the legal authority to amend taxes, which the Affordable Health Care Act is a tax according to the Supreme Court, what is to prevent him from just amending any tax to his liking? Mr. Turley, weigh in on this, if you would, Professor.
Thank you, Congressman. I have to agree. First of all, on your first remark about Article 1, as I've said before, it is true that they're all equal branches, but the framers spent the most time on Congress because it is this thumping heart of the Madisonian system. It's where the magic happens, and that magic is to take those factional interests, those interests that destroy countries, and turn them into majoritarian compromise. And when we get to the issue of taxes, as you've raised, that's one of the most divisive issues facing a country. And so when someone comes before Congress and says, I want my group to be excluded, it obviously produces a great deal of heat from people saying, well, how about my group? How long should this apply? It is perhaps the most divisive issue that is raised in Congress. And that's precisely why it was given to Congress, so that those types of issues would be subject to this transformative process of legislation.
So do you believe that that would be an unlawful constitutional act if the president started amending the tax code on his whim?
Yes, I do.
Let me ask you one other question, if I may, Mr. Chairman. You've mentioned remedies. What about the remedy of a mandamus? Would a mandamus remedy lie in any situation where Congress thought the executive had not enforced the law?
Mandamus can be very difficult in some of these if you're trying to use mandamus against the president, but you can challenge some of these decisions. For example, the HHS decisions is violating APA, for example. You can go with if you have standing to do so. Those are obviously a long process. And this is one of the things where I tend to get off the train with at least one of my colleagues. This is not an APA issue. This is a constitutional issue. It's a president usurping the authority of Congress. And to say that this is just something that we leave to agencies, I think radically misunderstands the severity of the situation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I want to thank all of our witnesses for an excellent hearing, a great discussion on what I think is one of the most important issues facing our country today.